Imagine for a moment that your teacher is dying and you're fortunate enough to be there as this happens. Imagine you would most likely be paying very close attention to their every word. You would want to hear every teaching. You would want to maybe in some ways hold on to them, knowing that you wouldn't hear them again. And this was Ananda's situation as the Buddha was dying. He had eaten a bit of bad pork. One of the sutras says, another one says it was mushrooms, a dish made with mushrooms, and he was dying. Ananda, as you know, was the Buddha's cousin and his very devoted attendant. He was always with him for more than 20 years. I believe he was always at the Buddha's side. And so, as you can imagine, he was beside himself, thinking about the Buddha's passing and about being left alone, in his mind, bereft. And they didn't have recordings, obviously. So that was going to be that. Although it is said that Ananda had a photographic memory and that he could recite by heart, and that he did, in fact, in the first council after the Buddha's death, repeat his teachings word for word. But in this moment, as the Buddha was dying, he kept wishing that the Buddha would give one more teaching to the monks. One last teaching that the sangha could have and could hold when the Buddha was no longer there, that could sustain them. And he told the Buddha this. And at first, the Buddha was a little annoyed. What else do the monks expect from me? He said to Ananda. I've essentially have taught them everything I know. He said, I'm old now. He was 80-something years old. He says, just as an old cart is barely held together, my own body is kept going with support. And he meant his own support. He said, it's only when I focus and concentrate my mind that I'm even a little bit comfortable. In other words, I'm tired. I'm dying. Can you just let me be? Just let me die. And then something happened. Something happened in his mind, and he softened, and he thought, it wouldn't be right if I don't say goodbye to those who have cared for me. It wouldn't be right. So, okay, let me give them a last teaching. And then the famous words. He said, Ananda, be islands unto yourselves. Refuges unto yourselves. With the Dharma as your island, with the Dharma as your refuge, seek no other refuge. And then, anticipating Ananda's questions, he adds, and how? Ananda is a practitioner to do this. How are they to be an island unto themselves, a refuge unto themselves, seeking no other refuge externally? He says, well, they investigate the very heart of things. They see how things arise. They see how they change. They see how they fade away. In seeing this, a practitioner is not worried, but lives at ease. And living at ease, they are free. So let me repeat that part. Seeing how things arise, how they change, how they fade away, a practitioner is not worried, but lives at ease. And thus, they are free. Seeing that things do not stay the same, a practitioner accepts this. Seeing that things go, a practitioner lets go. The student of the way moves with impermanence, and thus they are free. Now, this is one of the most famous teachings of the Buddha. Be an island unto yourself, be a lamp unto yourself, another translation says, because the word can mean either thing. Be a refuge unto yourself. And he was saying implicitly, do it together. And so these islands are really tied together, connected by a spit of land, sand or silt, and sometimes it's visible and sometimes it's hidden when the tide is high. And these tide islands, which is one way that they're referenced, they have the most delightful name, I think. It's called a tumbalo cluster. We're a tumbalo cluster, connected to one another. Sometimes we see that, sometimes we don't. But we are connected to one another by our love of Dharma. And I hope, I trust, our love for one another. Be islands unto yourselves. You know, he was really saying, don't worry, to Ananda. You don't need me. You have me, in fact. You have me in your own wisdom, your own realization. That's Buddha. You have the teachings. The Dharma I have taught for all these many years, 40 years, the Buddha taught, perhaps uniquely among spiritual teachers. And you have yourselves. You have each other, the sangha. That's it. That's it. That's everything you'll ever need. And so trusting the Buddha, aligning with Dharma, living in sangha, we support each other. We are each other's ground. A Theravada teacher by the name of Ajahn Lee said, just as a good rice field has 4 characteristics. The ground is level and even. The dike has a water gate that closes and opens easily. The soil is rich with nutrients, and rainfall comes at the proper season. In the same way, members of the sangha who are to be a field of merit for the world must be endowed with these 4 qualities. And so first, a practitioner is level, like even ground, because they're not self-involved. Whatever they do, whatever they say, whatever they think even, is not based just on their own likes and dislikes, their own desires, their own preoccupations. They're also not driven by anger, by ill will, by jealousy, by greed. They're not deluded in their views. They understand how things work. And they're not acting out of fear. I think this is a really important quality. They're not acting out of fear, out of anxiety. In other words, they're walking on the ground of reality. And thus, they aim to do what is right and true, what is good for everyone, which of course includes them. You know, I was thinking, when I tell a new person what I do for a living, I think I've shared this with you before, you know, invariably they'll say, oh, of course, you have such peaceful energy. And, you know, I mean, maybe, but my sense is that most often they're filling in the gap themselves because, you know, often we've spent like 20 seconds together. You know, what's your name? You know, what do you do? Well, I teach meditation. Oh, meditation, calm. That's what she must be. They expect me to be calm, given what I do. So it's a projection of sorts. And at the same time, it's not an unreasonable projection, an unreasonable expectation. Bhante Gunaratana, whom we are going to read next, tells the story of working as a chaplain for refugees fleeing from the Vietnam War. So this was in the 70s. And he got called by the Department of State to see if he would be one of the Buddhist chaplains. And so he was flown to a camp in Florida and there began to greet immediately plane load after plane load of refugees, many of whom had left their country with nothing. Many of them had come over and were sick. They were confused. I mean, just imagine. And they're being flown to the very country that's bombing the hell out of them. So imagine arriving in Florida. And they would get off the plane and they would see this monk in his orange robes. And some of them would just drop to the ground crying and bow over and over again. Or they would smile for the first time, probably in weeks or months. Buddhist monk, they recognized him, and it meant something to them. For however briefly, in a strange land, he became their ground. And so you could say it's our job as students of the Dharma, part of our job, to cultivate that ease of being and to spread it outward, to be level, to be grounded, because otherwise, what's the point of working so hard, sitting so long? The point, in case it gets lost in our struggle, is to put an end to suffering. This is a goal-less practice. As we're doing it, we're not worrying about what will happen. We're not worried about what came before. We really just do it. And there is a point to not suffer, to be free, to be at ease. And in those times when we're not calm, when we don't feel grounded, that's fine. That is our ground. Not fighting it, not wishing it to be otherwise. We are level, like the ground upon which we stand. Which always comes with us. We do not leave it behind. Number 2, a member of the sangha is like a water gate that opens and closes easily, right? So you have a rice field, you have the irrigation ditch along the edge, and the gate, the dike that opens and closes to feed water to the field. We are like that gate because we practice restraint. We follow the rules of the sangha. We gather in our senses. That is what concentration does. We have enough, but not too much of what we need to live. And we consider what we need and how to use it so we're not acting out of craving or out of greed. So this is closing the gate. We open the gate of our minds by not being possessive of places, of people, of things. We're not possessive of color, interestingly, meaning race, meaning class, meaning position. And we're not possessive of the Buddha's teachings. What we know, we share. Without preaching, without trying to convince anyone, we open the gate and we let the teachings flow through. Mostly, really, through the way we live. We are the teachings. And so that is why it's so important that these not be theories. Elliot was alluding to that in his Dharma glimpse. That's what we call it practice. You know, we try and we try and we fail and we try and we fail, and one day we try and it works. We surprise ourselves. We're able to respond in a way that even months earlier was unthinkable. We don't get so impatient. We're not reactive. We start to be more caring, more loving. Just like water flooding a field. I like to think of that water flooding that field lovingly, drenching it with the moisture that it needs, the nourishment that it needs. And then we're also like the soil that's rich in nutrients because we cultivate the 4 immeasurables: loving kindness, metta, compassion, karuna, joy, mudita, and equanimity, upekkha. And I read a very nice description of equanimity by Pema Chodron. She said, it's like a banquet in which everyone is on the guest list. Anger is invited, happiness is invited, insecurity is invited, lust is invited. Every part of you and every part of another is invited to take a seat at the table. We receive them all. We greet them all, and we spend time getting to know them. We say, yes, you're allowed to be here. Otherwise, how do we expect to get along? And 4, we are like seasonal rain because we have an affinity for goodness. We are persistent, we're intent in our practice, and discerning. In other words, we're not going about life willy-nilly and doing whatever we please. We're we're appropriate, we're timely and nourishing to ourselves and to others, like rain that falls at the right time, feeding the crops without distinction. And so these are the 4 ways in which members of the sangha are a field of merit for the world. This is how together we are a field of benefaction. This is how we become each other's ground. And I wanted to speak of this, really just a short teaching on sangha, on giving, really in response to a need. You know, just as happened when I was training at the monastery, there we responded, we created initiatives, we created programs when someone brought forward a need. And really, we're doing the same here. I'm not sitting in my apartment plotting, okay, now, like, what's a good training frame for the Ocean Mind Sangha? I'm not taking a structure and imposing it on something that I came up with in my head. I mean, I have a general, in the beginning, very general, very vague idea about how this would work. So I have a faint outline. And then I begin, this is in my case, and then I begin, and then I watch, and I listen, and I do my best to respond to what I'm hearing, to what I'm seeing. And whenever possible, I make sure that we respond together, because it's so much better that way. And so this is no exception. Because, sooner or later in a spiritual community, the need arises to care for one another in some or in various ways. And I've said this before, some of you already do this very naturally. You didn't need to be asked. Some of you have offered to help me with my work, with my travels. Some of you call or text each other regularly, visit each other when you can, ensure that there are times to sit that everyone can access. Some of you have offered to sponsor someone who otherwise might not be able to come to sesshin. Now, some of you suggested creating a sangha fund so that anyone facing a difficult time in their lives can have a little help. A little pot of gold that they can tap into, so that they can access resources freely gathered and freely given. The Buddha, speaking of giving, said, when a person who practices giving goes to an assembly, people take notice. I've always loved that. When someone is generous, people take notice. And so first, let me just say how proud I am to be part of this community, this small but mighty community of bodhisattvas, of practitioners, of noble friends. Because it is so inspiring to me, at the very least, to see you practice, to see you care, and to see you become larger in that care. to see you offer what little you have, because that is true offering. You know, it's not that I give you what I don't want, what I have left over once I take what's mine. It really is giving freely, giving generously, giving lovingly. And so I want us to be able to do that. I want us to be able to give each other in this way and to discuss the how. Because, as you know, giving is the first of the paramitas, the perfections, and as the Buddha said, the easiest to practice. Because we can always give something. And in giving, giver, receiver, and gift show themselves as they are, one single thing. You think you're just giving a little something. And I hope that if you look closely, you see that in that moment, everything is contained in that one act of giving. And so to end this Dharmet, they call it that in the, I forget where his community is, Kilfransdal, but they do these short little talks for morning zazen. So to end this Dharmet, so we can go to our discussion, just let me quote from Master Dogen's A Bodhisattva's 4 Methods of Guidance. To launch a boat or build a bridge is an act of giving. If you study giving closely, you see that to accept the body and to give up the body are both giving. Making a living and producing things can be nothing other than giving. To leave flowers to the wind, to leave birds to the seasons are also acts of giving. It is because of the merit of giving that one's own self comes into being. It is because we give that one's own self comes into being.